Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? No buys this week, no injuries to any of our top quarterback options. This week really should be a walk in the park when it comes to quarterbacks. If you're in a Superflex or a 2 QB league, maybe you're debating on a quarterback 2 or a Superflex option. If you're in a 1 QB league though and you're in the playoffs, you should pretty well be set. But let's go ahead and roll through it and let's see who some of the best quarterbacks are this week and who are some ones that maybe are a little bit more risky. The 49ers are allowing the second fewest passing yards to opposing quarterbacks, and the last time Stafford faced them, he threw for 221 yards and 1 touchdown. Not a bad floor, but not really that high of a ceiling, and more than likely you're going to see some numbers that mirror that once again. And I think it's important to note though that the last time Matthew Stafford faced the 49ers, his wide receivers were not fully healthy. And over the last 4 games, he has 2 touchdowns and no interceptions in each of those games. So he should have a pretty safe floor on Thursday Night Football, but maybe the ceiling isn't as high as some of the other quarterback options this week. The LA Rams are allowing the 7th most passing yards and 8th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. And if you take away that snowstorm game in Buffalo a couple of weeks ago, Brock Purdy has been a quarterback 1 in each of his last 6 games. In this matchup against the Rams, he's got quarterback 1 potential again. Over the course of his last 6 games, Patrick Mahomes has only thrown 2 interceptions, which is great news. The problem is in 3 of those 6 games, he's only thrown 1 touchdown in each. So because he isn't throwing for multiple touchdowns in a majority of games, and because the yards are lower this season than what they have been in the past, unfortunately Patrick Mahomes just hasn't been reaching his upside that we're used to seeing. Kansas City is allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so let's, say what it is. There's a good chance Jameis Winston throws for over 300 yards, throws for a couple of touchdowns, and tosses in a couple of interceptions just because. Joe Burrow is one of the best quarterback plays in all of fantasy football right now. He's got a great floor with a high ceiling every single week. Part of the reason why? His team sucks. Now, from purely a football standpoint, it's not great for Joe Burrow. He should be talked about as an MVP candidate right now, and he's not because his team isn't winning and more than likely is going to get left out of the playoffs unless they catch fire very soon and win out. From a pure fantasy standpoint, this is great for fantasy owners because the defense is so bad, the offense has to keep throwing the ball, and it gives Joe Burrow top 5 potential every week. We are still waiting to hear more about whether or not Will Levis will be able to play this week. As of right now, he is dealing with a shoulder injury, but coaches sounded optimistic that he may be able to go this week. As of right now, either of these options are going to be high risk. The New Orleans Saints allowing a lot of passing yards. They're allowing the 5th most passing yards in all of football right now. But they're not allowing a whole lot of touchdowns because they're allowing the 2nd fewest passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. That's not really that big of a deal for Jayden Daniels, though. Let's move the ball down the field and pick up all of those yards. And even if he's not finding the end zone through the air as much as we would like, his legs offer him the ability to still find the end zone on the ground. As of this recording, it still has not been announced who the New Orleans quarterback is going to be this week. Right now, I've got Jake Haener in there. It could end up being Spencer Rattler. It doesn't really matter who it is, though. They're going to be high risk no matter what. The New York Giants may be allowing the 5th fewest passing touchdowns and 7th fewest passing yards, but Lamar Jackson has been a quarterback 1 every single game this season except for 1. And he's been inside the top 10 quarterbacks every single game except for 2. It doesn't matter the matchup, Lamar Jackson is a low risk. Now, Baltimore allows the most passing yards and 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But Tommy Cutlets, are you really going to trust him in your lineup? Win or go home, first week of the playoffs? Probably not. If you're in a 2 quarterback or a super flex league, Tommy DeVito could be a decent start this week, but I'm not hoping that he's a quarterback 1 by any means. For the first time in basically 2 years, Carolina is finally a favorite to win a game. And if that is true, then that's good news for Cooper Rush and anyone else that may be trying to play him this week. Now, Carolina is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. They don't give up a ton of yards because teams eventually have run it against them this season, but over the course of the last few weeks as well, they've kept things a lot closer, and quarterbacks have had to start throwing a little bit more and a little bit more. They also find the end zone pretty often. But with Cooper Rush, he had a great matchup against Cincinnati last week, and he was all over the place. He just couldn't get the job done. So this week, can't be nearly as confident in him regardless of the matchup. Now, Dallas is allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, but it's also because they allow the most rushing yards and rushing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. So when you take a look at Bryce Young, maybe he is able to get out of the pocket and pick up a few yards, but he's not that type of quarterback that you're going to see put together big yardage days on the ground. Now, Young doesn't have a ton of upside, but he has only thrown 2 interceptions over the course of the last 5 weeks. And because of that, he has found himself flirting with being a pretty solid quarterback too, a majority of that time. Look at that. Aaron Rodgers finally finding himself back inside the top 12 quarterbacks once again. The first time since week 9 and only the 4th time this entire season he's been a top 12 option. And he's going to get a really easy defense this week. Right now, this defense is giving up a ton of fantasy points, a ton of yards, tons of touchdowns to every single position. It's not just quarterback, it's wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. Rodgers does have 39 passing attempts in back-to-back games, but I don't know if this game is that competitive for that long. If Jacksonville can keep it close for 3 quarters, then the Jets will probably be throwing the ball more times than not, especially if for some reason Breece Hall is not able to go again this week. Some of you may make fun of this and some of you may think it's a cop-out, but I'm going to make Mac Jones my Mando must-avoid quarterback for the week. Now, there's a couple of reasons why. Number 1 would be the Jets defense is a little bit banged up right now, but number 2, they allowed 331 passing yards last week. And I've already seen a couple of comments come up about, is Mac Jones worth a start this week, seeing where the New York Jets defense has been heading? And the answer is no. The New York Jets are still tied for the fewest touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks this season. And Mac Jones really hasn't been all that spectacular since taking over, and there's a high risk chance of turnovers to go along with it. For me personally, I'm staying away from Mac Jones. Even in 2 quarterback or super flex leagues, he's not worth the risk to try and throw in my lineup this week, considering, yeah, there's some injuries at the quarterback position, but there's still some decent guys that could be grabbed up, like a Tommy DeVito, who I feel like has more upside than a Mac Jones, even if the risk is still the same. When it comes to the fantasy playoffs, if I really need to stream a quarterback, I'm only looking at guys that have better defensive matchups than what Mac Jones has right now. There are some guys out there that you could take a look at. If you're realistically looking at Mac Jones, if you're one of those people that was asking if he's worth a start, you're going to be sweating out your matchup this week. And if you're going to do that much sweating, then you need help from our friends over at Mando. So jump on over to shopmando.com and use code word headliners, which is going to get you $5 off of their starter pack, which is a great way to take care of yourself this weekend so you're not walking around smelling like an absolute disaster and fantasy loser. But also over on Underdog, there's some different things that we can do to go lower than Mac Jones' current projections. Now, before I recorded this video, I took a look at the slider to see how many yards could I go and still take the under. And if you feel like he's going to have at least a little bit of a decent day, you can slide him all the way up to 249.5 passing yards and take the under at a 0.67 multiplier. So you could still add that projection if you wanted to your lineup and have a little bit of a safer outcome than what you may have if you kept his current line at 210 passing yards. Houston may be allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but they have allowed the most passing touchdowns to quarterbacks this season. And Tua is coming off 4 straight top 10 performances at the quarterback position. This offense is heating up. Tua looks good, and in this matchup, what definitely could lead to a lot of back and forth, Tua should end up being a really safe option. CJ Stroud, unfortunately, has not looked like the quarterback that he was last season. Now, whether it's due to issues with the offensive line or wide receivers being injured, all of that doesn't matter at this point. What matters is currently, he's a lot riskier than what we thought coming into the season. Since week 4, he's only been a top 12 quarterback 1 time, and he's only gone over 260 passing yards 1 time during that time frame. And Miami has been solid against quarterbacks. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position. So CJ Stroud definitely going to bring some risk for you this week. After a couple of back-to-back tough performances, the Denver defense is allowing the 9th most passing yards to opposing quarterbacks now, but they're allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. And Anthony Richardson's been playing better as well. He's been the QB4 and the QB9 in 2 of the last 3 weeks. And like I just mentioned, Denver's defense has been giving up some pretty big passing games the last couple of weeks out. So this week after the bye, we'll see if they're kind of back in the rhythm of things and if they can make life difficult for Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson, he's going to find some throws down the field. He's going to make some big plays with his arm, but really it's about what he does on the ground. But until he gets more consistent in the passing game, he's still going to be a high risk. Bo Nix has a solid matchup this week, though, and his quarterback 26 finish in week 13 was the lowest he has finished since week 4. So he's had some pretty decent upside for a majority of the season. And since Indianapolis is allowing the 6th most passing yards, Bo Nix should have quite a bit of those this week. In fact, over on Underdog, his current projection is only set at 237.5 passing yards. So if you feel like Indianapolis at least keeps this game close for a majority of the time, Bo Nix has surpassed that amount each of the last 3 games and can absolutely do it once again. Josh Allen, in a losing effort last week against the LA Rams, had one of the best quarterback performances of all time. He was the first quarterback ever to have 3 passing touchdowns and 3 rushing touchdowns in the same game. And we know Detroit's secondary can give up some yards. Right now, they are allowing the 8th most passing yards to opposing quarterbacks, but they've allowed the fewest passing touchdowns on the season. At least they're tied for it right now. The Lions' defensive line appears to be getting more healthy, which is absolutely going to be needed this week against Josh Allen. They have to create some pressure, and I do think they're going to be able to. And with the secondary being healthy now as well, that's great news to be able to force Josh Allen into either making a mistake or getting outside of the pocket. But when Josh Allen gets outside the pocket, we know he's going to run, and that could happen quite a bit this week. And his current rushing projection over on Underdog is at 34.5 rushing yards. And honestly, I'm going to go over on that because it wouldn't shock me if he does have to pick up quite a few yards on the ground this season. And one thing Detroit has struggled with over the last couple of years are mobile quarterbacks, guys that can get outside of the pocket and move. With no Alex Anzalone or Malcolm Rodriguez right now at the middle linebacker position, Jack Campbell is going to have to be able to pick up Josh Allen, and he's going to have to make him pay for getting outside the pocket. Hopefully not dirty the way everyone else thinks they're playing. In his last 4 games, Jared Goff has 9 touchdowns and only 1 interception, and he's kind of entered the MVP candidate race once again. And this week against Josh Allen is where he could really solidify whether or not he belongs. Because if he can beat Josh Allen this week in Detroit, he's going to get a little bit more love for that MVP. But it could also be one of those performances where he picks up a decent amount of yards, but doesn't really find the end zone because Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery take care of that. Buffalo is allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game right now to the quarterback position. So Jared Goff's ceiling is a little bit lower than what we've seen recently. If you're relying on Russell Wilson or Jalen Hurts this week in your quarterback position, I absolutely would be concerned on the variation of outcomes from this game because it could end up being a defensive massacre where both quarterbacks are struggling to be consistent for the entire game. I also could see both of them having solid fantasy days and being just fine, especially Jalen Hurts if he's able to score on the ground. So to me, Jalen Hurts in this type of a matchup, he's got a little bit of a better floor than what Russell Wilson does because he can still do a lot of things on the ground that Russell Wilson doesn't really do anymore. But we know that Russell Wilson can throw the deep ball, and sometimes it only takes 1 or 2 plays to make that happen. But he doesn't have George Pickens. So there's just a lot of different outcomes that we're going to have to experience with this matchup. Russell Wilson, for me, is a guy that has a lower floor than Jalen Hurts, but his ceiling is kind of in the same area. And this is definitely a matchup where both quarterbacks could struggle in the first half, and then in the second half, they could end up being just fine. Whatever it may be, if you have Russell Wilson, you may be looking elsewhere if you want somebody that's a little bit safer. If you have Jalen Hurts, I don't think you can even afford to sit him. Since taking over, Drake May has been pretty darn consistent. pretty darn consistent at throwing interceptions. For 5 straight games, he has at least 1 interception. And I would love to see him kind of clean that up a little bit, because that's really what's keeping him from becoming a high QB2, bordering into the QB1 status. Those turnovers are taking points away from him. And if he can clean that up a little bit, we're going to see a little bit more upside. And maybe in this matchup, if he keeps it clean, we start to see a little of that. But Kyler Murray has been having the same issues with interceptions. In fact, it's kind of funny that the interceptions started to kick up right when Call of Duty Black Ops 6 came out. He has 5 interceptions over his last 3 games. For essentially the first entire part of the season before this stretch, he only had 3 total interceptions. And he's only been a top 12 quarterback 1 time as well during that time frame. He can't turn the ball over. He's got to stop that. And this is a matchup that is going to allow him to kind of get back on track. But he's still very risky because he keeps throwing picks. The Big Show is not going to have an easy time this week trying to find his ceiling against the LA Chargers, who are currently allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game, passing yards, and passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Herbert, on the other hand, facing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game and the 4th most passing yards to opposing quarterbacks, has an opportunity to find his ceiling. But he might be a little bit too banged up right now, and hopefully we get a little more clarification over the course of the week just how healthy he is. But I highly doubt the Chargers are going to tell us anything other than Justin Herbert is just fine, so we probably aren't going to know much until game day anyway, when we actually see him out there. Jordan Love and Geno Smith have been the definition of solid quarterback 2s for a majority of the season, but I really feel like when people say their name out loud, they just assume they're like top tier quarterback 1s in fantasy right now. But Jordan Love only has 1 top 12 finish over the last 6 weeks. And Geno Smith has only thrown for 2 or more touchdowns 1 time in the last 6 games. So while both of them are giving you solid quarterback 2 numbers right now, neither of them are giving you a ton of upside. So if you're starting them in 1 QB leagues, you may need to fill in some guys around them that offer a little bit more upside. If you're starting them in 2 QB or Superflex leagues, though, you should be safe. On one side, we have Caleb Williams. He's kind of been the definition of a good quarterback. Not great, not bad, just good, just okay. And on the other side, we have Sam Darnold, who is playing fantastic right now. Not good, not great, fantastic. Caleb Williams hasn't thrown an interception in 7 straight games, but Minnesota leads the league with 20 interceptions on the season. Williams also has 7 touchdowns over the last 3 games. Sam Darnold now has 4 straight games with no interceptions and at least 2 touchdown passes in each of those games. Something's going to end up needing to break this week. More than likely, it's going to be the Chicago Bears, because that's just the way it goes. But maybe Chicago can be a little bit more competitive on Sunday Night Football. We'll wait and see, but Sam Darnold's been playing great, and Caleb Williams is going to be in the national spotlight. I really don't think anybody should be waiting until Monday Night Football to play their quarterbacks this week, especially if you're thinking about any of the quarterbacks from this game. It might be a decent matchup for Kirk Cousins, and that's the reason why I can't put him as a high risk. But over his last 4 games, he hasn't thrown a touchdown pass, and he has 8 interceptions. The dude that just signed a massive free agent deal with Atlanta is close to losing his job to rookie Michael Penix, who, by the way, is basically the same age because he was in college for 90 years. And for Las Vegas, we don't even know who the quarterback is going to be yet. Will it end up being Aiden O'Connell? Will he be just fine to play? Or is it going to be Desmond Ridder? Desmond Ridder may be revenge game against the team that drafted him, the Atlanta Falcons. But even with a revenge game, I don't know if we're going to go that far as to risk him in our fantasy playoffs. Yo, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Start and sit analysis is in the books for week 15. Good luck to everybody with their playoff matchups this week. I'll see y'all again on Saturday night for the live show. So hopefully by that time, you're feeling a lot better about your lineups and what you have in place. But if you have any last minute questions, if you need any last minute advice, we've got rankings videos coming out. The doc is going to have his injury report later this week. And of course, we'll be live on Saturday night and Sunday morning. But for now, Headliner Nation, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, turn on the bell notifications. Also, stay safe and healthy. And I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.